Number 75 of At Your Service with Haber and Martinez. I'm Haber. Martinez is off to my right. And today's episode is entitled Celebrating Constitution Day, Why the U.S. Constitution is So Freaking Awesome. You may notice that I'm wearing a shirt with some of my favorite people on it, a founding mother and several founding fathers. You've got Abigail and John Adams, the dynamic duo, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. What we're going to do today is we're going to kind of run you through a little bit of a timeline of what led up to the Constitution and what happened as a consequence of the Constitution and where we are now. And we're going to employ some videos to help us out. So I'm going to warn you in advance that about a third of this show will be videos that we're starting with. In fact, let's start with the first one right now to explain a little about the relationship between the Crown and the colonies at the time leading up to the Revolutionary War. Andre, video one.
Hi, Billy.
Hi, Maya. Oh my gosh! Is this a timeline I can walk through?
It is, Billy. It is. Now go sit in the corner.
No!
So in the 1730s, the First Great Awakening began, and a focus on emotion and passion was emphasized rather than intellectual sermons. Some say that the First Great Awakening led to an increased belief in democracy, equality, freedom of thought and speech, and other values that would later contribute to the American Revolution. In 1754, the Join or Die cartoon was published by Benjamin Franklin, the guy you really want to have in your wallet. Originally supposed to show the importance of colonial unity against the French and Indian War, it ultimately led to an increase in patriotism and a symbol for independence from Britain. In 1754, the French and Indian War also began. And this was ultimately a battle between the French and the British over territory that led to the taxation of colonists later on. And in 1763, we have the Proclamation line drawn. The British meant it to keep peace between American colonists and the Native Americans, but colonists saw it as a barrier to their freedom and sense of independence and adventurousness. In 1764, there were a series of acts, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, and the Townshend Acts, all which taxed items necessary for business and yummy food. I was really sad about the tax on sugar, and so is this chocolate bar, because you can't make chocolate without sugar. But anyway, these were meant to help pay for the French and Indian War, but the colonists didn't want any taxation without representation, and that became a common phrase used in the quest for independence. So in 1770, there was the Boston Massacre, a tragic event in which 5 civilians were killed by British soldiers. And propaganda surrounding the incident really blew it out of proportion, some people think, and it ultimately led to an increased sense of resistance against the British. So in 1772, the Committees of Correspondence are formed, and these were powerful political entities which basically disseminated pro-revolution information, and they were the brains behind the American resistance. In 1773, we had the Boston Tea Party, which was an operative political protest in which colonists threw tea overboard and turned Boston Harbor into a giant teacup. This severely angered the British, and so, in 1974, they passed the Intolerable Acts, which punished, along with other things, Boston by taking away their right of self-government. So when remembering how these acts are organized in the timeline, think about how intolerable the Intolerable Acts were and how the colonists couldn't take anymore, and therefore they were the last ones. So in 1774, we have the first Continental Congress formed, and this is a little picture of a bunch of politicians arguing. And in response to the Intolerable Acts, the Patriots created this Congress, where delegates from 12 colonies, which did not include Georgia, convened and established a boycott of British goods, but not British accents, because those are really sexy, am I right? And organized a second Continental Congress to meet later on. And then in 1775, finally, we have the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the first shot is also known as the shot heard round the world, and we'll cover that in our next video when we cover the Revolutionary War. So let's take a moment to think about why.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
God.
So I know it was a little.
Thank God, I was about to fall asleep.
Well, you know, you're not a history fan like I am.
I am a history
But the
fan.
reason that I'm cutting it off at that point is because I want to go backwards a little bit and just say that what you just saw was a description of really how the American colonists started losing patience with the crown. Because basically what was happening at this time was the famous line, taxation without representation, right? And they talked about briefly the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, all of these types of things, the intolerable acts, the coercive acts, all of these things were the crown kind of squeezing the colonists. Because at that time, basically, we were still considered British subjects, and the king needed money. Why did he need money? Because his coffers were bled dry after fighting the Spanish for so many years, and then the French and everything else. He needed a break, and he needed some inflow. And where better to get it from than whom he considered his tenants? But the problem really got exacerbated because they went a little bit too far, and people had enough. And basically, that's what caused ultimately the revolution.
And do you know why? Do you know why the British Crown went that far?
They were broke.
Well, but why did they do it to the colonists? What did they consider the colonists?
They considered the colonists basically wharf scum.
A bunch of pig farmers.
Yeah, we were wharf
We've
scum.
got the strongest army and navy in the world. What are these pig farmers going to do to stop us? Nothing.
And then, of course, if you watch The Patriot with Mel Gibson, you'll know how that went. I want to quickly roll video number 2, because one of the last things that they talked about was really the trigger. It is the initial starting point. It is the formal day that we consider in American history the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and that is what is known as the shot heard round the world. These are the battles of Lexington and Concord. Andres, can you roll video number 2?
The British are coming! The British are coming! Now the ride of Paul Revere set the nation on its ear, and the shot at Lexington heard round the world. When the British fired in the early dawn, the War of Independence had begun. The die was cast, the rebel flag unfurled, and on to Concord marched the foe to seize the arsenal there, you know, waking folks, searching all around, till our militia stopped them in their tracks. At the old North Bridge we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town. And the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your powder, take your gun, report to General Washington. Hurry men, there's not an hour to lose. Now at famous Bunker Hill, even though we lost, it was quite a thrill. The rebel Colonel Prescott proved he was wise, outnumbered and low on ammunition as the British stormed his position. He said, hold your fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Though the next few years were rough, General Washington's men proved they were tough. Those hungry, ragged boys would not be beat. One night they crossed the Delaware, surprised the Hessians in their lair, and at Valley Forge they just bundled up their feet. Now the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your blanket, take your sun, report to General Washington. We've got our rights and now it's time to prove. Well, they showed such determination that they won the admiration of countries across the sea like France and Spain, who loaned the colony ships and guns and put the British on the run, and the Continental Army on its feet again. And though they lost some battles too, the Americans swore they see it through. Their raiding parties kept up hit and run. At Yorktown, the British could not retreat, bottled up by Washington and the French fleet. Cornwallis surrendered, and finally we had won. Hooray! The shot heard round the world to the end of the revolution. The Continental rabble took the day, and the father of our country beat the British there at Yorktown, brought freedom to you and me and the USA. God bless America, let freedom ring.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you, Schoolhouse Rock.
It was much more entertaining. Now, can I interject a second? I don't
Of
know if
course.
you're there.
Of course.
What were the British doing in Lexington and Concord?
Well, they were trying to take munitions that were stored by American colonists.
Because they knew the colonists had already been telling them, we're not happy with what you're doing. We're not happy with your government. We want to start our own government.
So
what's
remember,
the thing that the tyrannical government will do?
take the guns.
They'll always take your guns because
So-
you got no guns. You can't fight.
Remember, this is Lexington and Concord is April 19th of 1775. Okay. So it's obviously before our Independence Day. It marks the start of the war. But again, as Ed has pointed out, it's not just that was the act that occurred on that particular day. But leading up to that day, you had all of these other things, right? You had the Stamp Act. You had the Boston Tea Party. You had the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre was a horrific incident where redcoats wound up shooting 3 Massachusetts citizens, killing 3 and injuring several. But and they were arrested, by the way, and they were accused of murder. But as it turns out, the truth of the matter was that they were basically standing ground, minding their own redcoat business when they got taunted by a group of about 200 American colonists. And once the colonists went from words to action and started throwing rocks and, threatening them with forks or whatever, shots started getting fired. Interestingly enough, it was John Adams who represented the entire lot. I guess they waived any potential conflict of interest. He represented the whole group of redcoats, very unpopularly, one might add, because obviously the passions could have been higher nowhere than in the colony of Massachusetts, because Boston was getting the biggest beatdown by the federal, by the crown, by the king and his troops. So you had all of these things that occurred before the shot heard round the world, and at that point, by that time, England already had the word, right? In fact, if you go back to those acts after the Stamp Act, that got repealed because Thomas Jefferson made a plea to the crown. And the crown actually listened to Jefferson and they repealed the tax, but then they came back with the tea tax and everything else. So all of these things kind of went around, and what was going on was this kind of circular argument, right? The Americans were saying the would-be Americans were saying we want our freedom, or we want at least a say at the table. And every time they did that, the king would turn around and say, well, it's time for me to flex my muscles now because you guys got to get in line, right? I can't have an unruly child and I must parent you. Do you want to chime in on something?
No, everything you're saying is
Okay.
100% correct.
So the war technically ends on September 3rd of 1783, but the pivotal moment that really marks the American victory, although not the formal end of the war, occurs on October 19th of 1781, when Washington sacks Cornwallis at Yorktown and Cornwallis surrenders. So, you can look at, like, for instance, World War II did not end when the Americans dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Technically, the end was several months later when the treaty was signed, on board the U.S. aircraft carrier. But for all practical purposes, when we dropped the second bomb, they were done. That marked the end of the war. So you can say that Yorktown, Lexington and Concord mark the beginning. Yorktown basically marks the end. So where are we at this point in time? We're 13 colonies that have agreed to unite. You saw in that first video that Ed hated, it started with the image of the snake that Thomas Jefferson had created and published in, I believe, 1754, many years before the war began. But basically, he already had the vision because he had been postmaster general. He had traveled throughout all of the colonies. He had been to Europe. He was a very educated and traveled individual, a Renaissance man, if you will. And so he knew at that point that it was only a matter of time before the crown affected one colony, which would cause chaos with all the others. So, for instance, the folks down in Virginia, They didn't have a problem with the crown at the time. They were making a fortune shipping tobacco and cotton and other products back and forth and doing trade with England. They were absolutely thrilled. They had slaves. England kept sending them over fresh slaves. They kept sending England back fresh tobacco and cotton, et cetera, et cetera. So they were thrilled. But up in Massachusetts, they were not happy at all. And then other colonies had other issues. So it wasn't a unified front. We were not a united colonies or United States at that time. But again, Jefferson had that vision. I mean, Franklin had that vision.
Many colonists were terrified that the British Army would come in and crush them.
Most were terrified because, as you said, it wasn't really untrue that they were farmers with pitchforks. That's really what they were. But even a farmer with a pitchfork, when pushed up against the barn, is going to fight back. So, Jefferson had the four. I keep saying Jefferson.
Mike, or he's going to eat a lot of pulled pork.
Or I meant Franklin. Franklin came up with this idea that if the 13 colonies unite, we're going to be just fine. So it takes us to the point where we've got delegates now from each of the 13 colonies. Actually, at that time, Georgia was not participating, so it was really only 12. But be that as it may, we had representatives from each of the colonies that created what was called a Continental Congress. And the Continental Congress, I don't want to jump too far ahead because we're gonna actually hit that after the Declaration of Independence. But it was the Continental Congress that ultimately did the Declaration of Independence. So the Continental Congress kind of served as this governing body, a kind of de facto what you would think of as Washington, D.C. right now, although not nearly as organized and not nearly as big or corrupt. Although I guess there was probably some corruption back then. But with that said, let's start with the Declaration of Independence, and then we'll go backwards and talk a little bit about the Continental Congress. If you could roll video number 3, please.
By the way,
all men are created equal, and they are endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not so fast, Mr. Jefferson. These words from the Declaration of Independence and the facts behind them are well known. In June of 1776, a little more than a year after the war against England began with the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia to discuss American independence. After long debates, a resolution of independence was approved on July 2nd, 1776. America was free, and men like John Adams thought we would celebrate that date forever. But it was 2 days later that the gentlemen in Congress voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, offering all the reasons why the country should be free. More than 235 years later, we celebrate that day as America's birthday. But there are some pieces of the story you may not know. First of all, Thomas Jefferson gets the credit for writing the Declaration, but 5 men had been given the job to come up with a document explaining why America should be independent. Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were all named first. And it was Adams who suggested that the young and little-known Thomas Jefferson join them, because they needed a man from the influential Virginia delegation, and Adams thought Jefferson was a much better writer than he was. Second, though Jefferson never used footnotes or credited his sources, some of his memorable words and phrases were borrowed from other writers and slightly tweaked. Then Franklin and Adams offered a few suggestions, but the most important change came after the Declaration was turned over to the full Congress. For 2 days, a very unhappy Thomas Jefferson sat and fumed while his words were picked over. In the end, the Congress made a few minor word changes and one big deletion. In the long list of charges that Jefferson made against the King of England, the author of the Declaration had included the idea that George III was responsible for the slave trade, and was preventing America from ending slavery. That was not only untrue, but Congress wanted no mention of slavery in the nation's founding document. The reference was cut out before the Declaration was approved and sent to the printer. But it leaves open the hard question: how could the men who were about to sign a document celebrating liberty and equality accept a system in which some people owned others? It is a question that would eventually bring the nation to civil war, and one we can still ask today.
Thank you. So remember, the Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is a statement by this Continental Congress, this group of brainiacs, this group of very dedicated, intelligent patriots, pieced together to send a message to King George III of, we're done with you. We are now sentient. You may not like it, but too bad, so sad, we're out of here.
It's literally what it's called, a declaration of our independence from your tyrannical, drunk, abusive ass. That's what it was.
So this Continental Congress that drafted the Declaration of Independence would ultimately develop what were called Articles of Confederation, which we'll get to in a little bit. That was kind of a bridge the gap between the Declaration of Independence and what would ultimately become the Constitution.
Right.
So this Continental Congress is kind of this disheveled group of representatives from the different individual colonies. And I know we have another video, but I want you to hold off on that, Andres. I'm actually going to take video number 4 and shift it down a little bit because I just realized I plugged it in the wrong place. So I have a lot of notes. I want to just kind of skim through them a little bit, and then Ed, you can chime in as you wish. But as to the Continental Congress, it was basically a provisional government, and it existed during the Revolutionary War and after, okay? It was the first framework of government. In March of 1781, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union would come into force. And again, we'll get to that shortly. But basically what it was a unicameral body, one group of people that were working together to try and convene and to come up with this Constitution, to come up with the framework for what would ultimately be America. Because we had these 13 sentient colonies, as we discussed. They had radically different needs, radically different cultures. You had a very prurient, what we would call today more of a Republican culture up in the Northeast, as opposed to what you had in the South, which was more of the Democratic, would ultimately become more of a Democratic, which is kind of interesting, I guess, as you flip and see it today. But that's kind of how it was then. It was the slave states, the states that were using slavery adamantly, that ultimately were the Democratic vote.
Well, nothing has changed. Nothing actually has changed, and it's a misnomer. It's still exactly the same. The Republicans have always, and they really came about with Lincoln. The Republicans came about with Lincoln. Before that, it was the Whigs. And they have always said less central government and let the states do what they want. Less use, the money that we have, the debt that we incur is for the greater good of the entire nation. Individual things, leave that to them. For example, slavery. Look, if you guys want to own slaves, that's your problem. We're not going to own them in the Northeast because we don't believe in them, or the truth was they didn't have a need for slaves because they didn't have so much agriculture. So they didn't really need slaves, so they didn't care. And they thought, well, let everybody do what they want to do. If you want to own a state slave, let that be that way. So they still are pretty much the same. And we could go, and this would be a show for another topic where I can show you that today the liberal Democrats are still the slave owners. But that's a story for another time.
Yes. So let me get back to the Second Continental Congress, where we have delegates from 13 colonies. They started meeting on May 10th of 1775 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was right after the start of the Revolutionary War. Again, you're talking about almost a year from the time of the shot heard round the world that the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. So it had succeeded the First Continental Congress, which actually started in September of 1774. And also, by the way, had met in Philadelphia.
Right.
When
That
they
was the
came-
White House.
when they came together in May of 1775, they basically reconvened, and there were 56 delegates, many of which were the same from the First Continental Congress. But there were some new arrivals. Number one, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. At that time, Benjamin was already very well traveled. He was a very well-known publisher, and ultimately, as I said, became postmaster of the United States. Also, John Hancock of Massachusetts was a new arrival, and Thomas Jefferson now came in and took over for Randolph, who was originally from Virginia. So now you got a guy named Henry Middleton who gets elected to replace Randolph as president, but he declines. And Hancock becomes president, which is why when you look at the Declaration of Independence later, Hancock is the biggest signature on there because he was the president of the Continental Congress. So Hancock's elected president on May 24th of 1775. And now there's delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. As I said, Georgia was not there during the Second Continental Congress initially. They did not participate at all in the first, and they did not send delegates until May 13th of 1775, when a man named Lyman Hall was admitted as a delegate from Georgia. Actually, he was admitted as a delegate from a specific parish in Georgia, not from the actual state of Georgia or colony of Georgia at the time. So the Georgians, they're doing their own thing. They're arguing back and forth. Do we want to get involved in this? Do we don't want to get involved in this? And ultimately, on July 4th of 1775, ironically, 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, you've got delegates from Georgia to the Continental Congress. So, meantime, again, war is already raging, right? We're already fighting the Brits. We've been fighting the Brits for a year now, and we don't have a centralized government. We don't have an army. We don't have a navy. We've got George Washington running ramshot and ragtag, and you've got little militias here and there, but there's nothing organized. There's nothing structured.
The Viet Cong were more organized than we were initially, to be honest.
So the Continental Congress was their first major job was to take on this war effort, and that's what they did. And they made George Washington, well, they didn't make him, they offered it to him, and they made him general and commander of the forces for the entire colonial movement, and that's what he did. Ultimately, we'd have the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but basically what the Continental Congress did directly is raise armies, direct strategy, appoint diplomats, make formal treaties, and act as a de facto national government of what would ultimately become the United States of America. Anything you want to chime in before we move on?
No. Well, I guess when we get to the part about why Washington became president.
We'll get there. So I want to go to the Articles of Confederation. So Andres, the next video we had in the queue, skip and go to video number 5, Articles of Confederation, and we'll show the other one after.
In the U.S., we love our Constitution. But it wasn't always this way. Before the Constitution and government we have today, we had a sort of prototype constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which created a nation of independent states only loosely linked together by a single Congress. The Founding Fathers intentionally designed a nation with a very weak central government. There was no judicial branch, no executive branch, so there was no president, which when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You know, the colonists had just been through a really bad breakup with the British king, and they're not about to get back together with a government who looked just like their ex, okay? We've all made that mistake before, okay? You go and date a girl like the last girl you dated, you're gonna get hurt, okay? Don't do this to yourself. The Congress, which was just a single chamber with a delegate from every state, I have some power.
Lost volume. You hear anything, Ed?
Maintain an army, and coin money. But they couldn't levy the taxes to pay
I
for
get
those
it.
things. In fact, under the Articles of Confederation, paying federal taxes was voluntary for the states, who of course were like, no thanks, we're good. The US had borrowed money from European investors and nations to pay for the Revolutionary War. But with no power to tax, the United States couldn't pay back any of those debts, creating a huge economic disaster by 1787. With no funds and limited power, the central government couldn't do much to protect peace at home. This became abundantly clear during Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when farmers in Massachusetts violently protested against the state's high taxes. So if the Articles of Confederation weren't working, why didn't they just make changes to it? Well, it was practically impossible. Amendments to the Articles needed unanimous consent, and the delegates from the 13 states had more opinions than a YouTube comment section. By the way, you should comment on this video right now. Say something nice about me. This weak Congress and a broke, ineffective federal government eventually proved to be too much of a burden on the United States. Because when 13 different state governments held all the power, nothing was getting accomplished. The Founding Fathers found this out the hard way. So they went back to the drawing board, drafting a new and improved Constitution, which is still the law of our land today.
See, that video was fun. That's all I'm saying. I love
Well,
it.
let me tell you, Ed, I looked through a lot of videos. I took the best of the best for every topic. It shows you how tough it is out there.
It's tough.
And I apologize, my thing froze up, which is why I had to log out and log back in, but the timing was good. So these Articles of Confederation kind of were a bridge gap between the Declaration of Independence, the King George III, and ultimately what would become the Constitution of the United States. So how did the Constitution get there? How did we get this Constitution? What is it? Well, before we get to the U.S. Constitution, I'm gonna give you a little bit of another little bit of a kind of a history lesson. We need to talk about a document called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is the English Charter of Rights. It was written in the early 1200s. It was an agreement between then King John of England and his barons. So it's not quite the same as our Constitution, as you're going to learn when we get into the Constitution a little bit deeper. But the Constitution was designed to affect everyone, all people, all Americans, all people in America, whether you're an American or not. The Constitution is designed to protect you from the government. The Magna Carta wasn't. The Magna Carta was a kind of peace deal between the king and his wealthiest subjects, who basically were his biggest source of income, because they taxed the people underneath them and then kicked up to the king, to the big guy, the big guy in the 1200s. I'm sure he got more than 10%. So what happens here is, in the High Middle Ages, the Magna Carta becomes Britain's law of the land, right? But it's not quite the same, as I said, as the Constitution. For the first thing, again, it only applied to the barons. But here's what's interesting, and I did a little dive into the math. So at the time of the Magna Carta, England had about 4.5 million people. And of those 4.5 million people, I can't tell you how many barons or baronesses there were at that time. Believe me, I have looked, I have dug, I have pried, I can't find it. But here's what I can do. I can extrapolate using today's numbers.
Is it a better kept secret than Epstein's fly list?
It may be. So if there were 4.5 million British subjects in, let's say, 1215 AD, today there's about 68 million. Today, there are exactly 426 barons and 9 baronesses. So if we do a kind of proportional distribution going back to that 4.5 million number, you're going to find that the percentage of people that were actually impacted by the Magna Carta, the percentage of the British population, is 0.00009467%. Now let's compare and contrast that to the Constitution. At the time of the United States Constitution, there were approximately 4 million people in the 13 American colonies. Now, remember, slavery was a big deal back then. So too were women, who were not considered sentient in terms of land ownership, voting. All of those types of issues were not granted to them. They were not quite as low as slaves on the evolutionary scale, but they were also not as high as men. So the numbers were about 1.65 million free white men, about 1.65 million women or other freed persons, and about 700,000 slaves. Let's call that the unevolved time of 1776. Even then, when the Constitution became the law of the land, when the Constitution was passed, it applied to 41% of the American population.
Right.
So it's a pretty significant difference. And of course, when we talk about the amendments to the Constitution, and obviously we had the Civil War, we talk about all those things, we'll see how much it's evolved above and beyond that. But getting to the Constitution itself, the Constitution, rip up my Magna Carta speech. I'm done with that one.
Thank God.
Getting to the Constitution itself.
All right, Mike, I'm still getting over. I was sick. Remember, I was sick for an entire week.
You've got September 17th as Constitution Day because that's the day the Constitution was signed. All right. Now, I want to do a couple things about the Constitution, but before I get into the Constitution, I want to play the video that we skipped over. It would have been video number 4. It's a 1-minute video.
George Gonzalez is making fun of me because I'm falling asleep. I was sick for an entire week, George.
Yeah, he made fun of me too, George. It's water. It's not vodka.
Hi, I'm William Devane. Did you know it took our founders 116 days to debate and draft the U.S. Constitution? Turns out they didn't trust the printing of paper money, but they did trust gold and silver. Article 1, Section 10, gold and silver, good for the founders, good for me, good for you. Roslyn Capital is a trusted leader in helping people acquire precious metals. Gold bullion.
All right, we can kill it.
And listen, if it's coming from Will Devane, you know you can trust it.
I just want to say 2 things about that. Number 1, at your service with Haber and Martinez neither endorses Roslyn Capital nor buying gold. We don't care what you do or who you do it with. That's your business.
But I do endorse Bill Devane.
I only showed the video because I thought it was interesting that Devane talked about the fact that it took 116 days for these 56 men to debate and ultimately draft this document. 116 days. Back then, these guys are like staying up at candlelight working 24/7.
Just for the record, there were fistfights, like literal fistfights in the halls where they were arguing. They got serious. They really got serious sometimes. It came to blows.
So I thought that was an interesting little ditty, and that's why we're playing that. But the Constitution itself is a very interesting thing in the way that it's structured and what it does.
Thank you, George.
There's an awful lot. There you go. There's an awful lot to talk about with regards to the Constitution itself, but I want to play the most famous part of the Constitution, which is its preamble. This is basically a reiteration of why this document exists, and then the document itself gets into facts and details and creation of our system of government and a basic structure for rules and governance. But if you would roll the next video, which would be video number 6, please. Also
the following program was produced by the United States Courts.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Thank you, Andrew.
I will, George. Madam X and I are still friends.
So, what is the U.S. Constitution? It is the fundamental framework of the American system of government. That's what it is. It's pretty simple. It creates a government that puts power into the hands of the people. It separates governmental powers into 3 co-equal branches: legislative, making the laws; executive, executing the laws; and judicial interpreting the laws. It sets up what's called a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one branch is able to dominate any of the others. They are supposed to be, and they are designed to be, co-equal. It divides power between the federal government and the states. It describes purposes and duties of the government. It defines the scope and limitations of governmental power. It prescribes a system for electing representatives. It establishes a process for ratification and amendment, and it outlines rights and freedoms of the people. It was written and signed in the year 1787, specifically, again, September 17th of 1787. It is the charter of government that came to be ratified by all states, and it continues to be the supreme law of our land to this day. It was written and signed in Philadelphia in the assembly room of what is now the Pennsylvania State House, then the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall. It's also the same place that the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was written during what's called the Philadelphia Convention, aka the Constitutional Convention, which was from May 25th till September 17th, as William Devane told us, again being signed on September 17th. The Constitution did not go into effect the moment that it was signed. It needed to be approved by people throughout a ratification process, which it outlined and ultimately was done. That's in Article 7, in case anybody cares.
Nope.
The Constitution was written by everybody, but the main author of the Constitution was James Madison. He is the man who is referred to as the father of the Constitution. He was the driving force of the convention throughout the entire summer of 1787. And he has notes that provide insight into the deliberations, which you can read, and they're fascinating. That said, it was the result of months of work, as William Devane told us, nearly 4 months, passionate, thoughtful deliberation, which, as Ed has reminded us, also occasionally came to fisticuffs. There were other people who made significant contributions besides Madison. There was a committee of detail, including a man named Oliver Ellsworth, Nathaniel Gorman, Edmund Randolph, John Rutledge, James Wilson. There was a committee of style, which included Alexander Hamilton, William Johnson, Rufus King, and Gouverneur Morris. And of course, you had Ben Franklin, George Washington, and John Adams, as well as many other famous patriots. But that's really what you're dealing with when it comes to the United States Constitution. That's what the document is, and that is what it does. Now, let's get one thing clear. We were not perfect then. We are not perfect now. But we've always strived to be better. We wanted to be better than what the king did. We weren't happy with the way the king did his business. We wanted to create a government, a democratic republic, a government that would be by the people and for the people, as opposed to by the monarch and for the monarch.
A government that told its leaders what to do, not a government where the leaders told the people what to do.
But that said, again, we were far from perfect. Look, we had slavery. We didn't count women as people. You know, there were all sorts of things that were going on there that
in a day, you know,
by today's standards are thoroughly unacceptable. But at that time, that's the way it was. And as you can see from one of the videos that we watched, where they talked about how some people wanted slavery brought in it, including Thomas Jefferson, very much wanted slavery to be in the Declaration of Independence, a repudiation of it.
Correct.
But it was impossible because you could never get a consensus and get those 13 colonies to join, because that was a point which was so sticking for so long that it would be another 100 years after that, 200 years, rather 100 years after that, before you would have an entire new war, American against American, in the form of the Civil War, over that one particular issue. So my point in saying this is that the Constitution as drafted was not a perfect document. However, the document itself created a means and a mechanisms to be able to be changed, to be morphed, to be modified, or, to use the appropriate legal word, amended.
Bingo!
And that's ultimately what happens when we get to the Bill of Rights. Andre, will you please play video number 7?
Hello everyone, this is a quick, easy way to remember the Bill of Rights. Which amendment is which out of the first 10? Not how to memorize each one. For that, see some of my other videos, but this is a quick, easy way to remember the first 10 amendments. First Amendment, 1, put up your finger. This is the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. 2, put up 2 fingers, your finger and thumb. It is the shape of a gun, that's right. The right to keep and bear arms. Amendment 3, put up 3 fingers, as in 3 is a crowd. There's too many people. Protect me from quartering troops in my house in times of peace. 4, as in 4 walls of my house, as in stay out of the 4 walls of my house. Protect me from unreasonable search and seizure. Amendment 5, put up 5 fingers and cover your mouth, as in don't speak, do not incriminate yourself. Plead the 5th. Amendment 6, number 6, hold up 6 fingers. Take your finger, point it at your wrist, as in your watch, as in you have the right to a speedy trial. Amendment 7, lucky 7, as in you went to Vegas and you got all 7s on the slot machines because you're wearing your lucky suit. The key word is suit. In suits at common law. With Amendment 8, you're not so lucky because now you got arrested and they put you in cuffs. Only your cuffs are too tight and they form an 8. They set your bail at $8 million. As in excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. And then there's Amendment 9, as in 9, the German Nein, for no, as in no, do not take away my rights. Just because certain rights are not listed in the Constitution does not mean that the government can violate those rights. Which brings us to the 10th Amendment. Put up all 10 fingers, both hands, as in stop. Stop, federal government. Stop trying to impose on states' rights. Stick to the powers delegated to you by the Constitution and leave the rest up to the states.
So the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. These are 10 things that the founding fathers either omitted or got wrong. And ultimately, they went through the process of being proposed and ultimately voted on, ratified, and incorporated into the Constitution. Each amendment, it becomes a part of the Constitution. So without getting into the nitty-gritty of the detail, I just want to point out one thing, and I know Ed is raring to go on this one. But the one thing I want to point out is, did you notice on number 1, when they did freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion, did you notice it was Tim Tebow kneeling?
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah, they showed a picture of Tim Tebow, which I find refreshing.
Right?
I know you want to talk a little bit about the Second Amendment. All of them are obviously important.
I mean, what I want to talk about is the amendments in general, but obviously the hot button topics are the ones that we can really get a fully understanding on why, in my opinion, and this is, I did study a lot of history, specifically certain eras of history, and this is one of them, because I love Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Bill of Rights, or at least he's credited with writing the Bill of Rights. When you look at the Second Amendment, there's all these arguments on what it says and what it doesn't say, but you've got to do like everything else when these things are written. You got to put yourself in that time period. Look at the Fourth Amendment. Why the Fourth Amendment? Well, look at what they were doing at Lexington. Look at what they were doing back then, housing guards in your house, breaking doors down because they wanted to see if there were any guns. They didn't need probable cause to go to your house to find the weapons depot or to see if you had any weapons or if you had anything that they wanted as a colonist. So they're trying to stop those things from happening again. And like they found out, having weapons is important to stop tyranny from happening. And many times I've heard people, look, we can argue about whether you should have a cannon, which, by the way, today they want to ban assault rifles saying it's a weapon of war. But back then when the Bill of Rights was written, you could have a cannon in your house. Obviously, I don't know if you could wheel it down the street because it was heavy. Certainly you couldn't put it in your pocket. But you could have a cannon. So if we look at the same situation, you should be able to have a tank in your house. So don't give me the weapons of war crap. Those were the most sophisticated weapons at the time. Those were the weapons that were being used at war, and they were allowed to have it. However, has there ever been a situation where guns have been completely banned? They have. And I don't know why the left never makes this argument. Let's look at the most famous, Tombstone. You come into the town of Tombstone, you had to give up your guns. You were not allowed to have one. Screw the Second Amendment, to hell with you. Okay, sounds pretty good, right? But let's look at what happened. What's the most famous gunfight in the history of the West? Tombstone.
Okay, Corral.
And let's see what happened. So let's see. So Tombstone was a gun-free zone
where there was a big shootout.
And the only people who honored it were the law-abiding guys. And these criminals, because that's what they were
the cowboys.
They were rustlers. Actually, they were stealing people's cattle.
Right, but the gang was the cowboy gang.
Right, and they were intimidating and committing all kinds of crimes in Tombstone as well. So they said, no more guns. And what happened? They showed up and went, come take our guns if you guys are so bad. And that's what the shootout was about. They were enforcing the ordinance of no guns allowed. So it teaches us again, even human beings are consistent. Gun-free zones will lead to an okay corral. That's what it's going to lead to. Now, why did they do it? Because I'm sure nobody had a chance to fight the constitutionality of that law. It's Tombstone. Who the hell's going to go in there and argue, hey, you should allow people to have guns?
No, as an aside, you actually do see that, because you never see a mass shooting in a gun zone.
Never.
Every mass shooting you see is in a gun-free zone, right? Whether it's at a school or a church or a nightclub or a rock concert, all those are gun-free zones.
I did a spreadsheet that I got from actually Mother Jones' website years ago, which is a very lefty website. And they had every mass shooting, I think, since the 50s. And at the time, I think it was like 2017. Every mass shooting from the 50s to then. You know what was the overwhelming, Michael, thing that they had most in common? It was over 95% of mass shootings since the 50s had this in common: gun-free zones. Overnight, that was the most common thing they had.
Well, it makes sense. You're not going to walk into a biker bar and try and commit a robbery. You're not going to walk into a police station. I mean, unless it's a suicide mission. You're not going to walk into a police station and open fire. I mean, unless you're watching The Terminator, it doesn't happen.
To be honest, one of the least common things was the type of gun that was used. If you look at it throughout history, the guns change. Now, you will see pockets where the same gun was used over and over again. And I think that goes back to what I talk about all the time. The media keeps calling them assault rifles. The media keeps saying an M16 is or an AR-15 is a death weapon. And what do you think you're projecting to the criminal mind out there who wants to do the most damage? They think I got to get an AR.
Get your paws on it.
But that's not even that's not one of the most dangerous ones. So there was a reason for the Second Amendment, and it wasn't so that we could walk around acting like cowboys. It was to make sure. It's the same reason that they made Washington the president. They wanted Thomas Jefferson and some others. But Jefferson and Franklin themselves said, no, we need the biggest balls in this country, the one guy that Britain might actually be terrified of. That's who we need to be our first president, so we can send a message. We're not screwing around.
How far have we fallen? Let me just run through the last.
Actually, he was a little bit like Biden. He used to fall asleep. He didn't really do anything. The one thing that man is credited for is he's the one that required everybody to call him Mr. President. It started with George Washington because he required that they called him Mr. President.
Let me run through the other amendments real quick. I'm just going to blow through them fast because we've had 27 amendments
and I'm
to the United States Constitution.
Now I'm a little
the first 10 are collectively known as the Bill of Rights.
Right.
The next amendment comes number 11, March 4th, 1794, affirms that the Judicial Code of the United States does not extend to foreign powers and that individuals of one state cannot sue another state. Number 12, ratified 6/15/1804, establishes the electoral process. You've all heard of the Electoral College. If you want to know more about it, read the 12th Amendment. Amendment 13, ratified December 6, 1865. That is the post-Civil War amendment that formally abolished slavery as a matter of constitutional law in the United States. Amendment number 14, ratified July 9th, 1868, applies due process to the states. The due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, which is in the Bill of Rights, applies due process to the federal government. The 14th Amendment applies the same due process to everybody as a matter of state law in each of the individual 50 states. 15th Amendment, February 3rd, 1870, establishes that the right to vote cannot be denied on race, and it grants Congress power to enforce that. So basically, it gives African Americans the vote. we abolished slavery a year and a half earlier. A year and a half later, what were once slaves now have the formal right to vote as a matter of constitutional law. Number 16, also on February 3rd, but 1913, is the establishment of Congress to impose income tax. And they are not allowed to do so with regards to differences in states. So there was a big argument at that time, and probably still today, that taxes for New Yorkers should be different than taxes from people in Missouri, right? But this amendment, number 16, basically says, yes, Congress can make taxes, but they have to apply equally to all 50 states. A couple of months later, on 4/8 of 1913, we have the 17th Amendment, which establishes the composition of the Senate and the electoral process for senators. 18, ratified on January 16th of 1919, creates one of our least favorite words in American history, just below slavery, or above slavery, not as bad as slavery, but right there with it, prohibition. The 19th, ratified 8/18/1920, gives women get the right to vote. 20th, on January 23rd of 33, establishes presidential secession line, dates of inauguration, congressional assembly, and secession rules for Congress. The 21st, ratified on December 5th of 1933, formally repeals the 18th. Prohibition is now over. The 22nd, ratified February 27th, 1951, establishes a 2-term limit for presidents. The 23rd, ratified 3/29/61, creates a presidential vote for the District of Columbia. 24th, January 23rd, 1964, abolishes poll taxes for every federal election. 25th, ratified February 10th, 67, establishes secession procedures for the vice president to assume the presidency. 26th Amendment, ratified on 7/1/71, creates the right to vote at age 18 as a matter of federal law. And the final amendment, the 27th, on May 7th of 1992, establishes rules for changing compensation for members of Congress. Those are all of our amendments, and collectively, those 27 amendments and the original document itself, the U.S. Constitution, are our supreme law of the land.
Right. And there was a couple of other amendments in there, and if you look at them and you really dive deep into the history, it's actually, for me, like you, Mike, it's very fun. There were things that were done intentionally because of the way the system was when we were colonists, right? Freedom of speech is another one. The bail amount. Remember, this was a tyrannical government. If there was somebody who was speaking in opposition to something that the government didn't like, the British could imprison you. You didn't have a right to bail. And then you're going to sit in prison until you wise up and come out and agree with us and join our side. Well, the founding fathers found out one thing. Number one, everybody's got an opinion. They're like a-holes. Everybody's got one. Number two, that if you actually allow people to speak, whatever their opinion is ridiculous, stupid, ignorant, moronic, offensive, abusive, whatever it is, you let them speak. Eventually, we can all get to the best answer. Because as collectively, we can sit there and argue. And that's why sometimes these things came to fisticuffs, right? I'm not suggesting we come to fisticuffs, but it's important to allow people to say what they think. The First Amendment is not there to protect things that you and I agree on, Mike, right? The First Amendment is there to protect you to be able to say shit I don't like. And for me to say stuff you don't like so that we can say it. So then somebody else can hear it and go, you know what? I agree with Mike Haber. Or, you know what? Mike Haber's an idiot. But they need to hear it. And then the bail amounts, and when you get to the bail, well, you think, well, yeah, bail, of course, makes sense. No, brother. They used to put you in prison and tell you to sit there. You know what? Donald Trump, I don't like you. You're going to prison. Joe Biden, I don't like you. You're going to prison. That's not what this country was about. Come up with a good argument. Show the people that the person who's saying something you disagree with is wrong. Don't, stifle them. Don't cancel them. Don't censor them. Let the people hear it all. So that's why these things are very important. And we need to remember them so that they don't get eroded, so that we don't end up with another government like what we had when we were colonists.
I have three final things. One is, if you have not seen the miniseries called John Adams on HBO, watch it. It is a seven-part series starring Paul Giamatti. It is absolutely brilliant. It's got a total runtime of about 8.5 hours, and it will be among the best 8.5 hours of television you ever. It's on HBO, so you can get it on whatever the Max app, or I'm sure you can buy it on Amazon Prime or whatever. And then the other one is Thomas Jefferson, which is on PBS.
My favorite.
It's only a 2-episode documentary that runs about 3 hours total. But both of them are absolutely fabulous. They will really explain to you what Ed and I tried to talk about during the course of this hour. And then the final thing that I want to say is actually going to be done by way of a video. Can you roll our last video, please?
Hi, I'm Mike Haber, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer. And this is a copy of the United States Constitution, and I want to give it to you. Why? Because too many folks have never read it, or they simply don't know what it means, or what it says, or what it stands for. And because it's not being taught to today's school kids, at least not to my son, Aiden, who's a 6th grader here in Miami-Dade County, and it doesn't get the focus or the attention that it deserves. So how do you get your copy of the United States Constitution? Simple. Just go to Haber PA's Video FAQ YouTube channel. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and send us a message through YouTube. Include your name, your email address, and your snail mail address, and Haber PA will mail you your own physical copy of the United States Constitution. This is a win-win, folks. We get subscribers, and you get instant access to 221 short, informative, and hopefully entertaining criminal defense, DUI, and BUI videos, noting that we're always shooting more. Plus, you get a hard copy of the U.S. Constitution, arguably the most important document ever written. So who wants a free copy? Subscribe to Michael Haber Law on YouTube, and remember that at Michael A. Haber PA, it's all about reasonable doubt.
Obviously, I'm not above the shameless plug.
I see that.
But I'm happy to do that. That video is obviously 6 years old because my son has graduated high school this last year, and he was in 6th grade at the time. So I still have several hundred of those pocket constitutions, and my offer still stands. I'm happy to send anyone for free. If you subscribe to the channel and send me a note, I will happily mail it out to you. With that said, I think we want to wish you a happy belated yesterday Constitution Day. We want you to remember that September 17th is the day that we celebrate the Constitution, because that's the day that the Constitution was ratified. We want you to know what the Constitution says. Haber PA uses a tagline all the time, #UpX2. It means shut up and lawyer up, or invoke your 5th and 6th Amendment rights. Well, how do you know what they are? You got to read the document. You got to understand it. You got to have some knowledge of what it is. And if you do, it'll serve your interests. It'll serve you very well. So I want to thank you for your patience. I know that this has been a little bit of an awkward show, and I apologize to you and the folks for the first video. As I said, believe me, if I could have found something that was any more entertaining, I would have. It was the best that I could do with what I had to work with. So, listen, I think we covered an awful lot of ground. We went from the pre-Revolutionary War mindset of the colonists and the crown all the way through the 27th Amendment, and then to date where we stand. So think about it. Please consider getting your own pocket copy. If you have questions, we're always happy to talk. History and etymology are two of my favorite things. And so I really do look forward to digging into these things deeper. And it's just hard to figure out how to siphon enough out to get it into an hour. But I think we tried. I hope we did a good job. Ed, I thank you for participating and for your patience.
No, my pleasure. I'm going back to bed, though. I think I'm tapped out for the day. I'm still recovering, but at least I'm not sick anymore. Thank God.
Well, be good, feel good. Happy belated birthday to Madam X. And we will chat later. I want to thank everybody for watching episode number 75. And we will not have a show next week. Next week is Yom Kippur. It is the highest holy day in the Jewish calendar. And we can't do a show out of respect for the Jewish people. So we will see you hopefully the weekend after, which I guess is the first week in October. In the meantime, everybody enjoy. You'll have the autumnal equinox between now and then. So look forward to fall and hopefully a little bit of cooler weather. And we will see you guys hopefully in 2 weeks. Take care. Thank you again.